I want to read this the way that I think it is meant to be heard. And so rather than have you reading along with it, I just want you to listen to how this feels. That which from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. A life appeared, we've seen it and testified to it, and we proclaim to you the eternal life which was with the Father and has appeared to us, which we proclaim to you, we have seen and heard, so that we also have community with us, and our communion is with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. We write this to make our joy complete. I call this the Kramer effect. What I mean is this. Imagine you're sitting around the table. It's a quiet evening. You're relaxing. There is vinyl on the record player. You've just refilled your glass of wine. There's a half-eaten piece of very dark chocolate cake that remains on the table because you're so full from a really good meal. And I'm your neighbor who doesn't usually knock when I come over. We're kind of at that level, but this is different. And so like Kramer, I burst through the door. And I say, oh my God, you're not going to believe this. I was walking to class, and on the way I heard the class, heard the scream, and I tried to chase the scream, and I couldn't find the scream, but then I found it, and then I had to jump the fence, and there was a guy on top of the roof pinned underneath the tree, and so I jumped up on the roof. It's like a superhero, and then three of us are lifting this tree off, and that's when I noticed the chainsaw, and the cops pulled up. This is a true story, by the way, so you can ask me about that another time. You would immediately wonder, something has happened. I wonder what Ben has experienced. In the original language, in the Greek, this whole opening, 4 verses, is one run-on sentence. One long thought, no breaks. The verb does not occur until the 3rd verse. So like everything I learned in Mrs. Musler's 4th grade grammar class, out the window. The opening of this letter is urgent. There's a sense of urgency to it. So if I burst through the door and I can't get the words out fast enough, and honestly, even what I'm saying, it really doesn't make any sense, you're thinking to yourself, there's something Ben has experienced. Tell me more. What have you seen? What have you heard? What have you looked at? What might you have touched? Tell us more. One scholar, Glenn Barker, says, this paragraph could be described as the author's language of ecstasy. He's had some sort of experience of God, of life, mystery, Christ, whatever name you give it. The letter opens, 0 to 60, no time. And so the intro is captivating, sort of draws us in, it piques our curiosity, and I think it's because we can all, at some level, relate to that. We've had experiences, probably at least one, where trying to get the words out couldn't happen quickly enough, where like that filter between what our brain was telling us to say and what was actually being said couldn't really keep up. And it's a short circuit, not for lack of experience, but for overflow of experience. We're like saturated in an experience, and it really is almost impossible to share because it's overflowing. So tonight we begin a series that will last the entire fall. I actually think it's going to go through Advent. And the cool thing is we'll wrap back up in Advent with the reading from John 1 that we just heard. So we're calling it Love Letter. This is sort of the focus we'll be on in the fall. How many of you have heard the phrase, God is love? All right, how many of you believe that in some way, shape, or form? You could make an argument, yeah, I believe that. So that comes from this letter, but it doesn't come until chapter 4. And so if we're going to use that as something like we say, or we think that this is accurate, we should probably also understand what it means in the context of the letter, what they meant by it when this letter was written. So, but here's the twist. 1 John is a letter of 1 John, and it is written for a community that is shaped by the Gospel of John. And so you can't understand the letter without understanding this book, this Gospel of John. And so we've got these 4 books in the Christian tradition. We'll call them like Mark and Matthew and Luke. And those first three are what are called the synoptic gospels, meaning they're so similar, they share the same sources, that they actually can kind of be viewed together and harmonize. And all the gospels are a very specific type of literature called gospel, which is really like theological propaganda. It's theology with an agenda, and it wants to make a claim about Jesus of Nazareth as the Christ. Now, those are all huge words. What any of that means, we're not going to get into right now. The Gospel of John, though, so if you sort of take these 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, so different from the Gospel of John. So you've got 4, but 3 of them are like very, very similar. Gospel of John, very, very different. For example, in the Synoptics, in the stack of three, Jesus deals extensively with what he refers to as the kingdom of God. Not much about eternal life at all, but in John, it's backwards. In the Gospel of John, it's almost all about eternal life. He mentions the kingdom of God once. So it's kind of inverted. Now, this is fascinating. Part of why I wanted us to sort of get this balance going into the fall. Almost a third of Jesus' words in the Synoptic Gospels are parables. We've just spent the summer sort of invested in the parables, sort of exploring these and reading ourselves in the parables and through them. In John's Gospel, there are no parables. So you start to realize, like, man, this is like very, very, very different. Instead, Jesus' words are organized over the course of 8 what are called discourses that on the initial read, they're basically like really abstract theological statements. The point being, Jesus is framed very differently in the Synoptic Gospels versus John, both in the method, sort of the style, but then also the content. It's very different stuff, both what the writer is trying to say about Jesus and what Jesus is even saying. Very different stuff. The reason I think this is important is this. The earliest churches, not only did they not have the Bible, right? Maybe they had the Hebrew Bible. They didn't have the Christian New Testament as we think of it. They also didn't even have all 4 of these. They didn't have all 4 of the Gospels. They probably had one, maybe not even that. They maybe had a section of one of the Gospels. So you'd likely find these communities that were reflections of one particular gospel. So you'd like encounter a community and be like, oh, this is a John community, right? This one's more of a Mark community because it was a community shaped by this one particular reading and understanding of Jesus. And so I was trying to think of it as like, if you grew up Catholic and you walked in for the first time to like a Pentecostal service and there were flags and people speaking in tongues, right? You could step back and go, okay, those are both technically Christian, right? But they're night and day in terms of the theology they affirm, in terms of their expression of that theology. So they use totally different language. The music is different. They seem preoccupied with different things. They refer to God in different ways. Their understanding of Jesus is different. So like baseline church, God, spirit, okay. But other than that, it's like, whoa, right? These are like totally different things. I think this is the kind of distinction that we have to make when we approach this letter. Because the writer of John came from a very particular, and I would say peculiar, community, and out of that community, later generations kept writing from the same perspective, the same understanding, using the same language as the Gospel of John. And so this letter is shaped and written by that same basic group that produced the Gospel of John, generations later. So the reason I want to set the stage is because I think when we get to the letter part of it, when we get to 1 John, we have to understand that the interest of 1 John is not like Christianity overall. And it's not just like, well, we're going to talk about Jesus in general. It's clarifying, amplifying, and commenting on John's specific understanding of what all that means. Does that make sense so far? I know that was kind of nerdy. I teach the Bible as literature at Stetson from time to time, so I can get sucked into that. Let me summarize like this. 1 John is born of, written from, and for the community of people that read and lived by the Gospel of John. Pretty straightforward. So their views on whatever it is they're experiencing, right? He starts with this ecstatic experience. Whatever gets addressed in the letter is shaped deeply by John's understanding of Jesus, the world, life, and God. Which begs the question, what is John's understanding? The Gospel of John of Jesus, the world, life, and God. Without reading the whole thing, should be terrifying to try and do the whole thing in one night. But let me take a crack at some major themes and I think clarify some important approaches. And most of this, I want to say, comes from the recent work of a scholar called John Shelby Spong. And so I'm going to steal and quote from him shamelessly, and really a bunch of the research that he's been doing, that he's pulled together. And I actually was going to have us, initially the thought was, I was talking with Ian about this over the summer, we were initially going to read the entire letter tonight, which wouldn't take long. It would have taken about 15 minutes. It's only 5 short chapters. And maybe you still want to do that as homework if you dare. The problem is the more I read it, the more convinced I became that we cannot even hear the letter of 1 John apart from our misreading of the Gospel of John. And I think because of that, apart from our misunderstanding of the Christian faith, based on our misreading of the Gospel of John. So this misreading of the Gospel, I think, is due to these three assumptions. First, we assume that the Gospel of John is written for and from a Greek or a Hellenistic mindset or experience. Second, that because of that, it is primarily dualistic in its message, meaning there's these sharp distinctions between up and down, between transcendence and immanence, between God and human, between good and bad, right? It's bipolar, right? It's here or there. And then finally, that the Gospel of John is literal, that it's meant to be read literally. And even though that's the way that John has traditionally been handed down to us, some scholarship came about in the 1960s as a result of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's opened an entirely new world in terms of reading the Gospel of John. So in contrast to these accepted assumptions, we've learned that this book actually is the peculiar and specific creation of a mindset that is profoundly influenced by the Jewish experience rather than a Greco-Hellenistic one. And that the popular first century form of Jewish mysticism is actually what shaped in dramatic and significant ways the message of the book, which is a message of oneness, wholeness, also called non-duality, and finally, that literalism can never be applied to this book. And I know that's a sharp statement, and it'll make more sense. Because literalism leads us to believe that religious language can capture truth and can fully explain it. Whereas mysticism, the mystical, begins with the inability of words to capture truth. And really, the mystic would say, even the inability of our experience to capture truth. And so a mystical perspective is at the heart of the understanding of what's actually going on in John. So this clarifies a bit. This is what John Shelby Spong says. Mysticism expands words beyond their normal limits and calls the mystic into the ultimate experience of wordlessness. The best that words can do is to point beyond themselves to a new reality that words can never contain or even describe. And then I love this. This is one of my favorite statements in the book. John's gospel, perhaps more than any other part of the biblical text, makes a mockery of literalism, constantly holding it up to ridicule. And it got me thinking about sort of what he means by that. So just a couple of examples. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says crazy things, okay? He says, like, you must be born again. And the response is, how? Can I crawl back in my mother's womb? Right? This is like a deep sense of humor. This is exposing what is clearly mystical, metaphorical language to this person who's supposed to like play sort of the dolt and go, how do I be born again? Can I crawl back? And like the same thing with the woman at the well. Jesus is like, oh, let me give you living water. And she's like, well, where's your bucket? Right? If we read it the way it's presenting it, it's making a farce of the idea that this understanding of God can be put in literal language. It simply cannot. So John is constantly making fun of literalism and constantly pointing to a different way to conceive of spirituality as an experience of life. And by the way, I mentioned there are no parables in John. I would argue that one of the major reasons there aren't is because, for the most part, the whole Gospel of John is written in what is pretty clearly parabolic language, parabolic literature, meaning it's not concerned with the literal and the factual. It's concerned instead with drawing the reader into a deep experience of life. In the same way we've experienced this summer, the parables drawing us into themselves, right? Not telling us something about the world, but instead changing the way that we interact with it. I think that's what the whole Gospel of John is trying to do. So the writers could care less whether or not we think there is a physical bucket, right, with the woman at the well. They want us to be going, wait a minute, have I ever experienced that living water, that thing that he's talking about, right? It doesn't matter. The well doesn't matter. The bucket doesn't matter. It wants to leave us with that sense of sort of curiosity and thirst, which is very different than asking questions about like literal, factual, historical. Now, part of the way we know this book is Jewish, rather than Greek, is that its pervasive mysticism comes through the Hebrew wisdom tradition. And it's not something that is really talked about in Christianity, which I think is a shame. But that entire reading that Dan offered, the first reading from the book of Proverbs, is written from the perspective of wisdom personified. right? Blessed are those who walk in my ways, who walk in the way of wisdom, which is and was and always will be. So the wisdom tradition arose in part because the Jews had to adapt their understanding of God to the current realities of their life. Does that sound familiar? That's sort of what's been happening for all time. Like, we think God is like this. Oh God, the world's falling apart. We need to understand God differently. So even this, and this is like built into the text, right? So God is their comforter in the days of slavery in Egypt. God is the vindicator and the guide in the Exodus and the wandering years in the wilderness. God is the conquering heroic warrior in the defeat of the Canaanites. God is the one who is actually transformed by the insights of the prophets. God is the one who is transformed. So the idea of a changing God is not exclusive to the story of the Jews. This is the story of human life. God is never static in human history, always changing, ever evolving. And the reality focuses, really, the force of this change is the understanding of God as always found in the changing circumstances of human life, bumping up against the unknown and expanding our consciousness of God. So doesn't this sound precisely like what Dan said in the video, right? A new understanding of God. Maybe this is what is most needed, that this wrestling, that the participating in the adaptation and the evolution of our consciousness of God, this is the tradition we've inherited. Not all the same answers, but the same invitation to wrestle, to be a part of the change. And so wisdom, over time, came to be perceived as an aspect of God that was immanent, that was with people right here, a God who could touch human lives deeply. And so to walk in wisdom for the Jews came to mean to walk in God or to walk with God. To learn wisdom meant to learn God. To hear wisdom meant to hear God. So the understanding that the God that the universe itself couldn't contain, much less temples built by human hands, came to be perceived not so much as a being who was present with them, the way a person would be present next to me, but rather as a permeating presence throughout all of life. A permeating presence throughout all of life, in whom all things are, and who is in all things. So this is right back at what we said a couple weeks ago. We talked about the theologian Paul Tillich, and he talks about God not as a being, but as being itself, as the ground of being, the ground from which all being arises. So the point is, there was no escaping the divine presence, right? That sort of God is up there and we're down here thing out the window. Out of the mouth of wisdom, it was said, truth moved, insight was gained. But the important thing is that with wisdom, it was insight into ourselves. The journey into the self was thought to be one of the most profound journeys into God. And this journey into God through the self is this mystical, practical expression of what we mean when we talk about non-duality, right? Oneness. And this actually remains in the tradition through the Christian mystics. You've got all the way up to the 13th century. St. Francis, one of his famous prayers is, "Who are you, God, and who am I?" And we tend to think of these as different questions. What is so radical is that he is asking the same question, right? You want to know God? Know yourself. Dive deep into your own heart. That's where you begin to discover what it is you mean when you say God. Anyway, this is the place where mysticism enters the tradition. So all the major themes that are found in the prologue of John's gospel, which we read a little section, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. These same themes, the same language is found in that book of Proverbs, right, that attributes the attributes of God experienced as immanent in the heart of life itself, which are called wisdom, right? Named as wisdom. And so God's revelation, the Word, right? That word word, was a part of the understanding of the transcendence of God, right? Which was still sort of like separate and out there from the beginning of the universe, but God experienced as immanent in the materiality of human life, in all things, was talked about in terms of wisdom. And so both the Word and wisdom were understood as manifestations of God. And again, we have to be careful not to immediately make this sort of black and white, this or that. We're not talking about dualism here. This isn't here or there, up or down. This is both. This is all. This is an expression of oneness, right? It's not transcendence versus immanence. but oneness. We could say integrity. They're connected. So both the word and wisdom were calls to life, calls to love, calls to being. And so over time, both of these hymns began to hint at this growing awareness that God was not to be perceived as a being, no matter how majestic and how distant or otherworldly, but instead, this is the beginning of God understood as a verb. God understood as a verb, calling, informing, shaping. And the point is, doing all these things into being, calling into being, forming into being, shaping into being. This is what philosopher John Caputo speaks of as the event harbored in the name of God. This is God not as a being, but as a call. We've even gone as far as to say not as existing, but God as insisting. That call. So the author of John's Gospel, in his prologue, he may either be using an already created one, or maybe he's creating for the first time this Christian hymn based on the book of wisdom, the Proverbs, to express this mystical unity, this mystical oneness that the human life can have with God. And he's asserting that this is actually the unique thing about Jesus of Nazareth, is this oneness, this life-expanding oneness with God, which the author of John believed that was what Jesus was pointing to. That's what he was inviting people into. So there's some background, sort of how we get John from that mystical perspective. The question is, how did that go so wrong? Right? How then did we come to read John as like Jesus, space invader from up above the clouds in like a people suit? Totally opposite of the understanding of the Gospel of John. How do we end up with that deep misunderstanding of the Gospel of John? Good question. I'm glad you asked. As the church expanded into the Greek and Hellenistic world, the early Greek thinkers, who were also the leaders of the church, were dualists. They were. That's the culture they inherited. So they understood God and human life, spiritual things versus material things, souls versus bodies. These were separate. These were two different things, even antagonistic. They were divided. They were opposite. They were different realms. And so they didn't know the language of Jewish mysticism. And so as leaders, they couldn't read John's mystical writing, which saw Jesus not as this sort of space invader from another realm, but instead Jesus as the defining human life, bringing together into oneness the human and the divine, right? Materiality and the sacred, displaying a sort of heightened God consciousness. Nor could they understand this idea of the divine as permeating all things, right? A permeating presence which opened all people to this heightened consciousness of the sacred. These concepts would have been utterly foreign to them. And so, of course, they get a hold of John's gospel and they immediately take what is primarily about oneness, about life and experience in this world, and they start to break it all apart and go here, there, good, bad, black, white, right, wrong, and sort of pull at the fabric of what John is actually trying to do. So let's land here for tonight. There's this really straightforward statement in the opening words that I think ties into the mystical experience of I love that language, a life-expanding oneness with God, a deeper dimension of God consciousness. So the line is this: that which was from the beginning, which we've heard, which we've seen with our eyes, which we've looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. What seems obvious here is that the authors want to make crystal clear that whatever it is, whatever the content of the letter, whatever follows this ecstatic, over-the-top introduction, is not something we read about, right? I didn't go to seminary and read a really, really good book, and I want to tell you what the author thinks. We didn't watch a video and take a quiz. This is not a lecture-based learning outcome. This is something we have seen, we have heard, we have touched, we've tasted. And again, let's not immediately literalize this. Like, oh, what did they touch? Right? Did Jesus come back and they physically touched the human person, the being, Jesus? No, he's saying we want you to experience what we've experienced. In fact, we want you to have your own experience. This is what we want to share with you. Not just our thoughts, not our ideas, not our theology. And then the question is, what then have they experienced? We want to proclaim to you the word of life. That clears things up. The word of life, great. Interesting, the word, there it is, sort of appears again. Again, this was connected with sort of the idea that God was somewhere else and from time to time had to be revealed. That was sort of the thought about the word. More interesting is that the standard reading of John has been to assume, and I love it, that the word of life, that this is actually a title. And so if you read it in English, in the Gospel of John in the Bible, it's actually capitalized like that. And it's made to look like everyone was like, oh yeah, this is definitely a title for Jesus. That's what he's talking about. But I'll tell you this, and I was rubbish at Greek, so take it with a grain of salt. I assure you it is neither capitalized nor is it a title in the original language. The phrase actually just says the word of life, which is better translated a message about life. And this is important because he isn't saying we're here to proclaim Jesus. Instead, he's saying we're here because we want to give you a message about life. And notice the things he doesn't say, because we so often read these into it. I think, especially people who've grown up in religion or church or whatever, he's not saying, I'm here to proclaim to you the message of salvation. He doesn't say, I'm here to proclaim to you the good news. Right? The word gospel doesn't show up. He doesn't say, I'm here to proclaim to you the message of the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, but rather he says, this is a message about the nature of life. This is a message about the nature of life, which actually makes a lot more sense because he's been saying, we're living this, we're experiencing this. And then Jesus, yes, is the one who initially showed them this life that they're now sharing, but Jesus isn't the message, actually. Life. Life is the message. If we could paraphrase it, we could say it like this. We want you to know we've experienced the kind of life Jesus said was possible. If we could paraphrase that whole intro, I think that's probably pretty much what it would say. We want you to know we've experienced the kind of life Jesus said was possible. Now you can begin to see how different, and we might sort of put in parentheses, dangerous, this feels compared to the typical reading of John, the standard Christian perspective. In modern Christianity, Jesus is the revelation. Jesus is the word. Jesus is the content, and Jesus is understood to be the message. But for the mystics who wrote John and then went on to write the letter of 1 John, Jesus isn't the revelation. Jesus is understood to be the one who does the revealing, right? And modern Christianity says, pull back the curtain, look, it's Jesus. And what John's perspective is that Jesus is the one who's pulling back the curtain and going, look at this life. This life is possible. He's not behind the curtain. He's the one who's pulling it back. He's the one who's doing the revealing, introducing this depth and density and consciousness into this life, into this world, such that the ultimate invitation is not Jesus, but is life. This life-expanding experience, this life-expanding oneness with God. And we'll come back to here, I'm sure, over the course of the next few weeks. But this is actually, like, if you don't want to take my word for it, this is what Jesus prays in John's gospel, in John 17. He doesn't pray, God, I just hope that one day there will be enough lights and smoke machines and worship bands that everyone will worship me. He doesn't. He says, God, my prayer is that all people would be one as you and I are one. This experience of God consciousness that I'm having in this life, in the material world, I want that for everyone. That depth of living, that kind of integrity, that experience of what it means to be alive, I want that for everyone. Feels dangerous. It feels like a very different message. I'm actually not sure if I'll have a job next week, but I believe that this is actually what's going on in the Gospel of John and in the letter of 1 John. So this is an experience that challenges and destabilizes all of the binary distinctions that the Jewish religious system would want to make at that time, to codify, clarify, certify, and defend. And in fact, if you read up on it, part of what gave rise to this mysticism that leaves us with the Gospel of John and the letters is the fact that these early Christians, just before the writing of the Gospel of John, this community specifically had been excommunicated from the synagogue. And so part of their lean into mysticism was this new need to find a way to understand their Jesus experience universally. They had been told they no longer belonged. And they had to find a way to understand their experience of this life. This also challenges modern Christian notions. Hoodlums. Are they setting off all our alarms? Get them. Whoa, all right. We won't blame anyone. You know who you are. Shameful. So this understanding, this also challenges modern Christian notions that it's enough to think. It's enough to agree. It's enough to believe the things that you think about Jesus. No. The crazy thing is that the question for a mystic is not, what do you believe about Jesus? The question for the mystic is, how are you experiencing life? Or more simply, maybe, are you alive? Are you alive? That was just the intro to the discussion part. The sermon is going to be awesome tonight. I'm telling you. We're going to do it differently. We're actually going to have discussion. We're going to have discussion here, sort of on the tail end. And I wanted to sort of give that framework so that as you have that conversation, you let all that stuff kind of swirl around. So, how have you experienced God, life, communion? You could call communion like sacred oneness. I'm not talking about bread and wine. I'm talking about that sort of understanding of communion with God or with other people. But keep in mind, though, the author in the first line of this letter is using these words sort of interchangeably. And again, this is because the writer is grasping for language to match his experience, and it doesn't work that way. And so I think we also, maybe if we wanted to grab some contemporary language, we could say, how have you experienced love, oneness, depth of consciousness, the unconditional, the universal connection, mindfulness, belonging, community, friendship, hope, whatever you need to substitute in here to make sense of the question, this is what we're asking. How have you experienced that? Not what you believe. Not what you believe. I want people talking about theology. What have you experienced? How have you experienced it? Whatever that means to you. And let's also acknowledge, we've said this a few times in the past, we're probably not talking about expressing this in literal language, in precise language, in scientific language. Instead, we're talking more along the lines of poetry. This is sort of the language of the mystical. Does that make sense? So this question, but then like blown wide open. We're going to play by the house rules, which means there are no me monsters. The point is for us all to have a conversation, not for you to get your voice heard. So let's make sure everyone gets a chance to share. What are we at? 6:15. So let's take about 5 minutes, talk around your tables. I'm going to pull us back and try and get you all to share some experience, and then we will wrap things up. So go. And if you're at a point where you're not you don't want to talk tonight, if you're not in that headspace, don't pressure yourself to do it. Find a place where you can sit alone with your thoughts, reflect on it by yourself. You don't have to talk, but if we can have some conversations around the table, awesome. Go. All right. All right. We're making our final approach. We're going to be landing here soon. A couple people willing to share how you've experienced God? Yeah, right. All right. There's a TV show called Broadchurch, and it will make you feel all of the feelings. So, fair warning if you watch it. You will learn more about who you are, though. Introspection. I like what you're doing there. In the second season, I will not give it away. I assign it to everyone as homework. Broadchurch. Okay, anything other than Broadchurch? I feel like this could become a cult real quick. David.
That often the experiences I've had are in the common, the ordinary aspects of day life, not religious or spiritual experiences.
Yeah. The sort of maybe the surprise in the non-set apart, non-intentional kind of stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Robert.
We were talking about our kids, about how, so we have two daughters, and the way that we experience them is completely different than any other humans will, but we both share that.
Ooh.
There is this, like, we made this, we have this existence, and like, when you meet our kids, they're goofballs, but they're not that way all the time. But we're the ones that know and understand that, because we've seen them when they're in pain, when they're ecstatic and lose their minds, when we see them in a way that no other human will ever see them. But that's something that we share in our life.
Okay. Very cool. Some book material there.
But don't you think that's true of any one-on-one human experience? When you have no agenda and you're open to who they are, you open yourself up to that. The other thing is, when you go in nature and it's just you have
All right, let me recap for those that haven't heard. So Robert was saying he and Jennifer shared the experience of their kids that is unique to them, that no one else in the world sort of has their experience of their kids and shares that the way that they do. And then Daniel was saying, that's also maybe transferable to all human relationships in the sense that no one else has the same experience of another person that we have, that those are all sort of pretty unique. And then also just being in nature, maybe intentionally getting outside of the systems. Yeah, Frank.
Without going into detail, I just had an experience where I was at a retreat leading a labyrinth walk, and at the end of it, I was in a community setting, and all of a sudden, all the boundaries between us dissolved. And there was a part of me that went away. There was a part of me that wanted to rejoice in what I did to make this happen. But then at the same time, I was blown away by the moment of being there. There was this, I don't know if it was tension, but there was a beauty, there was an awareness of something beyond who we were and what got us there that just was it was magical,
Indescribable.
What's that?
Indescribable.
Yeah, and we all felt that for the next several days of the retreat, and it was like what I was so thankful for was the sharing I had, the follow-on experiences with several of the folks who had done the labyrinth walk with me, to be able to share in more depth and connect with them at a level that I would never have been able to connect with them.
Yeah. How many of you have had an experience on like a retreat where you intentionally went away and had some sort of so profound experience? A couple of us, maybe? Or even like a weekend or vacation. This is the interesting one. I love asking this. How many of you, even though you had that experience, you look back on it and you're like, I don't believe a lot of the same things I believed back then, but the experience was still legit. Like I can't, like that's the one thing, like I don't, when I make the list of things, like I don't believe that, I don't believe that, right? But then I get back to like, but that was still real. There was something there that happened. Fascinating. All right. Any others? Maybe one more? Yeah, Jen.
So for me, this always comes down, well, not always, but it often comes down to connection.
Okay.
And for anyone who saw me the night that we had the kids event here, and then the unveiling of the collective kids space, I couldn't stop crying for the light. I couldn't have a conversation. I was crying very uncontrollably. And I was so joyful. And I mean, it's emotional for me to just talk about it.
Yeah.
And I had to go home and kind of collect myself and try to figure out what that was about, because it was so profound for me. But it was very much that experience.
Yeah.
It was very much connection.
Yeah, Lewis.
Very nice, very good discussion. One word came to mind for me was being co-creator with God. We have a part of this.
Okay, so kind of the responsibility of being co-creator, or responsibility maybe in and of itself. How many of you would say you've had some sort of experience of life or feeling like you come alive through some form of creativity? Okay, maybe there's something there. How many of you have ever had a near-death experience? Okay, we're gonna talk about that a little bit next week, because I think that's one of those things where like perspective, sort of maybe too much perspective sometimes, but that can sort of open up some of those experiences. All right, so if God is love, which is I think maybe sort of what got us here, and we're going to get there in a number of weeks. I guess the point is then that the invitation is not to believe the propositional idea that God is love. However we might want to like try to explain that, right? This is what I mean by that, and this is sort of my theological justification. I think because that famous phrase comes from this letter, which flows from the Gospel of John, the only way we can understand that is as an invitation to experience God as love. To experience God as love, to live this experience, to practice it to choose it, not to think things about it. Which I think is true of any love letter, right? The goal is not to explain with scientific accuracy the anatomy of your love. And I know that people do this, right? I believe that my physical attraction to you has released a cascade of hormones and endorphins, and our social chemistry produces feelings of confidence and bonds us relationally. We should couple. No, this is that's never been a love letter, I don't think. I don't know, maybe it has. Sheldon, right? For the win. It's the point of a love letter is not to accurately document the behaviors through which you prove your love. It's not to confine to literal language an experience which cannot be apprehended. Instead, love letters are ecstatic poetry. They aim to draw the beloved into the experience of love, to do our best to give them the experience that we're experiencing, to share the joy. And that's the end of that little 4 verses that we read tonight, right? We want to share this with you to make our joy complete. It's to share that. Pete Rollins says, love letters always reach their destination because they are for the one who is writing them. The person writing it is the one that needs to express it. And I think in this case, it's interesting. It's like doubly true because this is a letter written from a community of love for that same community of love. And even though it's already reached its destination, right? The ones that wrote it needed to write it. And maybe it reached the others. Maybe it reached everybody else that it was intended for. I also think centuries later, I hope that we can also listen in. Because I think if we do, I think we can be captivated by this invitation to life, whatever that means. And we'll sort of get into that a little bit next week. Amen.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. It's the opening to the Hebrew, what we know as the Shema, what these Jewish people of this community would have prayed each morning. The last word, Echad, it is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one." But once again, English doesn't do the job of the original language. The word echad, there are multiple Hebrew words for one, but that word, very, very rarely used, and it literally describes one from many parts, one of fibrous things woven together. One. The oneness of God with all of these mystical attributes together. As we read these mystical words, they are really only understood when they are read in or said in the community, which forms us, which formed these people, that they read from their perspective, and this oneness of God became open to them, not seeking truth, but seeking understanding in this maze of mystical streams. So as we come to the table, we understand that this is not a dualistic thing. Anything that may have been put in your head about communion or the Eucharist over the years, let it kind of fall away like ice melting. And understand that the bread is both bread and something more than bread. The wine is both wine and mystically more than wine as we celebrate this moment together, as we have this symbolic meal that symbolizes the mystery and the oneness of this being that we sort of call God or Adonai in the Shema. And we begin to dig into these things over the next several months. May our dualistic understanding go away, and may we reach into kind of this neo-monastic place where we can live as community and push and pull and tug and converse and try to find understanding. So, to do that, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to celebrate the Eucharist by sharing with one another. If you don't want to do this, feel free to stay where you are, but the rest of you, I'm going to make you get up and move. We can't really make a circle in here because of the shape of the room. We're going to make an amoeba-type form. And we are going to, I'll start it here with the bread and the wine, and I will pass the bread to the person to my right, and they'll take a piece, and I'll hold the cup for them, and they'll dip it in and take the elements, and then I'll pass it along. And it's going to take some time, and we're going to do it in silence. Reflecting, been a lot of heavy thinking stuff in this room tonight. And so, everybody get up. Find your way into that amoeba-like shape. Come on up here.